my question too here is, how do you see the weight of something like this for the average Catholic who's not formed, nominal, etc.? I think the Holy Father is even more brilliant than he puts forth. And to say that he would maybe conceal certain things or deliver them in a certain way because of the sensibility to be a receptor is dependent upon grace and spiritual maturation and things like that. So that's a little bit of a question that I have about how you see something like this translating to the Holy Father reads it, oh yes, yes, yes. All of a sudden it's a movement like TOB, which is actually, the difference there is those are teachings from a Holy Father over a course of many, 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 many years. So explain a little bit of that.
Absolutely.
If you can.
So let me start. And if I seem to not directly address your question, correct me, because I want to answer exactly the question. So there might be a hole somewhere. I don't think there's any degree of the Holy Father being secret about what he knows. I think he wants to tell people the truth, and he wants to tell people the truth, of course, according to the way that they can hear it. I don't think it's right to overwhelm people with information that they can't process. Now, my stance, and I think it would be everybody's stance, is while giving baby food, you don't mix the baby food with cyanide. Now, good baby food doesn't have any cyanide in it, for sure. Or even arsenic, a lesser poison. Still isn't good, and it need not contain such things. So, whatever we tell the people, we tell them, not in a way that bashes them over the head with a total picture all at once, but we tell what we tell without the admixture of error that we think we have to put in, and we don't. Like, for example, when talking about the atonement, the redemption, the Pope here talks about what everyone basically thinks about the atonement and the redemption, Protestant and Catholic.
And so, I'm sorry, just for reference, from where are you reading?
This is Introduction to Christianity. I haven't read the book. I only opened to the page when, or somebody showed it to me.
You would read the author too, just for the...
This is Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger.
So it's he himself, right.
So this was
before he,
many years before he
But it's important to note that someone's not paraphrasing him, so when you're reading from this, you're reading... Right.
I'm only going to be reading his words to you. All right, let's see. Okay, to many Christians, and especially to those who only know the faith from a fair distance, it looks as if the cross is to be understood as part of a mechanism of injured and restored right. It is the form, so it seems, in which the infinitely offended righteousness of God was propitiated, satisfied, again, by means of an infinite expiation, or satisfaction. It thus appears to people as the expression of an attitude which insists on a precise balance between debit and credit. At the same time, one gets the feeling that this balance is based, nevertheless, on a fiction. One gives first secretly with the left hand, but one takes back again ceremonially with the right. The infinite expiation on which God seems to insist thus moves into a doubly sinister light. Many devotional texts actually force one to think, like Christian faith, in the cross visualizes a God whose unrelenting righteousness demanded a human sacrifice, the sacrifice of his own Son. And one turns away in horror from a righteousness whose sinister wrath makes the message of love incredible. This picture is as false as it is widespread. Now, that picture describes basically what anyone would say about the atonement when asked about it, unless they were to say something to the extent of, the cross really wasn't what it was about. It was about God just showing forth his unconditional love, teaching us how to live. He didn't have to bleed to death. He didn't have to be tortured. He's just showing how much he loved us. Well, that's not right either. But people are trying to get away from this, God's wrath being propitiated through the death of his Son. We don't have a model. Okay, the Pope knows this model is wrong. This is the model that's even defended in the Handbook of Catholic Apologetics. The error is so deep that we've lost all sense of direction. Now, from the Pope's new book, I don't know, maybe 30 years later, okay, in Jesus' Passion, he's proposing...
Which new work is
I
this?
believe this is Jesus of Nazareth.
Holy Week.
Part one, I don't know if it's part one or part two.
It's probably part
Okay.
two.
He's proposing the beginnings of an atonement theory. The church doesn't have an atonement theory right now. The church knows the basics of what not to say and the very basics of what to say. That namely, through the Paschal mystery, we're made right with God. That what has been sullied is now made clean. All things are reconciled in Christ. We don't know exactly why, though. We don't know exactly what the suffering had to do with it. We know for sure that it was through suffering. And a lot of theologians are protesting that, saying, it wasn't through suffering. God isn't into suffering. But we have to hold on. No, it was through suffering. And somehow everything is made well. And we don't know exactly why. We don't have an official theory of the atonement. So everyone's arguing about it. The Pope here begins to state the atonement theory in divine justice. In very general terms, I believe, maybe for the first time, I might be mistaken about this, but it's not developed, but it's starting the ball rolling.
Mm-hmm.
And Father Cantalamessa wrote a book years ago which also sets up the fundamentals in divine justice and in which this would fit. Father Cantalamessa doesn't say this, and the Pope doesn't say what Father Cantalamessa says explicitly here, but elsewhere he does. Okay, so from the Pope's book. In Jesus' passion, all the filth of the world touches the infinitely pure one, the soul of Jesus Christ, and hence the Son of God himself. While it is usually the case, anything unclean touching something clean renders it unclean, here it is the other way around. When the world, with all the injustice and cruelty that make it unclean, okay, not pleasing to God, comes into contact with the infinitely pure one, then he, the pure one, is the stronger. Through this contact, the filth of the world, diminishment in this language, suffering, death, sin, filth, is truly absorbed, wiped out, okay, and transformed in the pain of infinite love. The pain is essential. We don't know how, though. We don't know why pain. If we reflect more deeply on this insight, we find the answer to an objection that is often raised against the idea of atonement. Again and again, people say, it must be a cruel God who demands infinite atonement. Is this not a notion unworthy of God? Must we not give up the idea of atonement in order to maintain the purity of our image of God? A lot of theologians think so. It becomes evident that the real forgiveness accomplished on the cross functions in exactly the opposite direction. The reality of evil and injustice that disfigures the world, injustice, okay, and at the same time distorts the image of God. In other words, we think that he's behind it.
Yeah.
This reality exists through our sin. It cannot simply be ignored. It must be addressed. But here, it is not the case of a cruel God demanding the infinite, which is what the atonement theory to date has been. It is exactly the opposite. Total opposite. Okay? God himself becomes the locus, the center of reconciliation, and in the person of his Son, takes the suffering upon himself. God himself grants his infinite purity to the world. Now, there's a leap there, but he's obviously right. God himself drinks the cup of every horror to the dregs, every horror, everything that we've suffered, and thereby restores justice. Now, he's right, but it's very general. Restores justice through the greatness of his love, which, through suffering, transforms the darkness. He's essentially drawn the outline of what this fills in. Whatever atonement theory comes in the future will follow what he said and not what he condemned here. All right? What we're defending whenever we talk about atonement theory is what he condemned. We don't know which end is up at this point. It's total chaos and a jungle. Christian apologetics is reduced to rubble right now, even when it works. We're arguing something that is contrary to the faith according to Benedict the 16th before he was Benedict. He never retracted this. This is true, but lo and behold, we have what we have. Now, this is the model for the atonement. This blank, this silhouette has not been filled in. But this is the container for what is filled in there. If he had the filling in, really, the filling in can be done essentially in one sentence and all of its implications. In the sentence, a suffering and dying person can't be doing my will.
That's right.
Okay? God's will is for goodness, beauty, truth. Suffering and death is a violation of that. The atonement involves taking what ought not to be, according to God, and somehow making it what ought to be without God changing his standard. He has to take that which is against his will. By definition, deprivation of a do good, it's not God's will. God is good, he wills the good. Suffering is a deprivation, suffering is not his will. Okay. That which is against his will by definition, and somehow making it consistent with his perfect will, without changing the situation itself, it's still suffering. How can it ever be made consistent with his perfect will again? That's really hard to do. This describes how he does it, and it makes sense. This describes what has to be done and what has to be avoided. We have to avoid talking about God demanding infinite satisfaction. He doesn't get upset like that. He's not huffy. All right? He doesn't go from angry to... It's really, it had a time when it explained things to people, but really now it's crazy talk if we try to answer real questions from real people. This is the model. This is the content. So if you take this model, new wine really, and try to put it into old wine skins, you burst the skin. However, so you can't take this and put it into the old model and have it work. You can, however, take the old model, everything that's ever been said by anyone of authority or saintliness, and put it into this, and it fits perfectly. There's not a single problem. But what's the assumption that goes on? Oh, here's a paper from someone who's interested in my opinion. I'm a professor, so I take the paper and try to fit it into what I know, and it just collapses. Can't make heads or tails of it, and it shows in the notes. I can just show you the things that people have written. Very smart professor, very devout, trying to fit this into the old model, and it doesn't work. But there's nothing contradicting this. There's no contradiction between this and the old model, as long as you understand the correct relationship. What's old isn't wrong. It's just illumined by this. The old model doesn't illumine this. This illumines the old model. And that's not true because I'm smart or well-read. I'm not well-read, and I'm smart, but not smart enough to come up with that, because I was trying to do good philosophy, and I didn't come up with anything that was in there. Everything that was there was news to me and a shock and seemed unbelievable every time that it came. The notion, a suffering and dying being can't be doing my will. Well, that's totally different than everything I've ever known as a Catholic. Of course a suffering, it's all about suffering, and no. Totally different than what I had arrived at through my own thinking. Now, my own thinking was really important in being able to put language to what was shown. But I did not arrive at these conclusions through my own reasoning process. I was informed.
So that's an important distinction. So, in other words, like the revelation is not you taking dictation of the Holy Spirit.
Absolutely.
Like the scriptures.
No.
It is you, because I didn't understand
even the scriptures
that.
weren't that. The scriptures use the words and the worldviews of the people who received them.
Oh, okay.
And you know what? I'd be really leery of any kind of revelation that did anything other than, well, A, use the words and worldview of the person receiving, and B, anything other than what's already been said by the church, run away. What do I mean by that? New Apologetics is going to say the same stuff, but it's not going to be revelation at all. It doesn't have to touch revelation. The revelation part is over. All we have to do now is say, oh yeah, I guess the church really did teach that. And now cite the catechism and cite the doctors of the church in a way that doesn't make the same mistakes that are in the minds of the people. And we don't have to rely on revelation at all. We just rely on what is already there in the doctrine. And that's really enough. I don't know if you noticed on New Apologetics, one of the articles, Theodicy of Divine Chastity, part 1. And it doesn't really do anything other than quote the Catechism and St. Therese at one point, and this other obscure abbot who wrote a good book. You can reconstruct the radical thesis in divine justice out of the quotes of things that are old hat.
Right. So
it's already there under our noses. We can't see it.
Okay.
Now, the first thing that has to happen is that the church needs to be able to preach what she has been given in a way that is self-consistent. So all of the things in the deposit of faith need to be able to hang together in a way where if I preach one of them, I don't thereby ignore or negate something else that's equally important. For example, and this is very telling about well-intentioned people who are smarter than they should be, okay, like, genius level people who are Catholic and Orthodox, and what can happen. A lot of rhetoric is going around about the problem of evil right now. It's fashionable, right? Because people are beginning to think about it just without needing an education. It's just on the minds of people. And we're responding to that. Christian apologists are responding to the questions. And typically, what happens is you try to mollify the questioner and convince them that, no, really what you see is not evidence against God, but God could have a plan. And couldn't it be something like this? Couldn't it be that the world is hard so that we can learn to be virtuous? Or things like that, the typical thing. And now, Father Spitzer, very highly revered, okay? Best of the best.
Yes.
Who's higher than him? Who's more reliable than Father Spitzer? More educated than anybody, basically. Probably one of the most educated people in the church. Now, he is engaged with secular audiences. Almost all the time. Catholics, of course, but always in a format that needs to appeal to a secular audience. To be credible. In order to even begin to say what you need to say, you have to be credible. You have to respect science. Of course. Now, in talking about the problem of evil, Father Spitzer, very zealously to defend the faith against objections, said, God created an imperfect world. And this is essentially a quote. I can get the real quote. There's many of them. God created an imperfect world so that we could learn certain things, like stoic virtues, like courage or compassion. God created death so that we could, whatever. Now, this is contrary to the faith. He doesn't mean to do that. He means to defend the faith against the objections of critics. He wants to be orthodox. But he knows that in order to get his foot in the door, he has to be rational, respectable. So how can he say that God is against death, that God created the world well and just, in a state of original justice, as the church teaches? Well, he kind of can't. So, or as far as he thinks, he can't. So he presents it in a different light. Since the fight is over here, this is what people are interested in. They're not really interested in original sin. That's so ridiculous. That's so ridiculous that okay.
Right.
So here's the front line.
He's seeing it.
Here's the front line. So what he says is calculated to be effective to the person. But in doing that, he's compromising the doctrine of original sin, compromising the doctrine of original justice, and these things are explicitly defined in the Catechism. God didn't create death. We would have been immune to death had we not sinned. God didn't create suffering. We would have been immune to suffering had we not sinned. It's in the Catechism, plain as day. But that's not plausible in front of the group of physicists. So, or at least with the tools that he has right now. So, what does he do? He hushes that up and says what will bait people in. Now, I had like 15 minutes to try to get all this out in a way that you could understand. And so I said, after he came out of his first talk, we were just making small talk at first, like talking about philosophy, talking about what Stephen Hawking thinks, talking about, and he's like, wow, this is good, let's link websites. You're doing New Apologetics, let's link with the dimension. I was like, yeah, sure. I was all psyched, right? Okay, so he does his talk, and then I pick him up. I said, so you still in the mood to talk shop, or are you beat? He's like, oh no, I'll talk. And he's like, okay, fine, let's get in the car. And as I'm pulling out, I said, would you be interested in hearing me out if I said I had a theodicy in which God is just as we conceive of him in classical theism, except he's perfectly opposed to every evil. Doesn't allow it for a purpose as a means to an end, but is infinitely opposed to it, just like a child would be. And he's like, pull the car over. And so I just need you to sit for like maybe 10 minutes. I said, you have to suspend everything that you know and everything that you've worked on and everything that you publish. And that's completely offensive and obnoxious, okay? But it's true. I said, you won't be able to follow this if you have in mind what you've had in mind. So just humor me as if, just in charity, and hear me out for this short time.
Was he good
You
humor
said
about
you
it?
wanted to do it, so...
Was he good humor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he sat and he listened, and he said, that's the most consistent theodicy I've ever heard in my life. But I can't get over this one part, though, that thing about original sin. Because, I can't use that apologetic. And what he was talking about was my statement that natural evil comes from moral evil, which is really what the church teaches. All the evils that we experience in human life, the vulnerability to nature gone awry, comes from the fact that we stepped out of
The bounds.
the bounds.
Yeah.
Now, all natural evil comes from moral evil, or at least the human experience of natural evil. Not to say there wouldn't be volcanoes happening, not at all, but just the human vulnerability to tragedy caused from nature.
So what was
Now,
his...
he said, I can't use that apologetic because that goes against everything that we know from science. And I said, no, it doesn't. It goes against the scientific zeitgeist, which means spirit of the times. It has nothing to do with science. It has to do with what scientists sort of feel the world to be. It has nothing to do with any conclusions of science. And he said, yeah, but I don't think I could do... I said, but you know that the church requires that you believe it. He said, yeah, in faith, I have to believe it. And I said, well, so you're telling people something that you don't really believe? So there was cognitive dissonance here, okay? But it's all good. He wants the truth, and so do I.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying believe me because I'm saying this is just the church.
Talk about it,
And you
yeah.
love the church, and you're trying to teach people about God, and you're doing a good job, but this is not what the church teaches. The church doesn't teach that God created death, but you do. You have to look at that. And so he saw it, and it was so quick, though, that we didn't have time. And I start to continue on without the notes, and I'm driving, trying not to crash, and so I say, that's not the whole apologetic. This is a complete thing. The redemption, how we say this, well, really it's this. And I tell them about a suffering and dying being can't be in the will of God, and how I've been able to explain Christianity to people who are atheists and have a total bias against everything that's been said, and they're silenced, and they take very seriously what was said. When it's construed in terms of suffering not being God's will, and he has to somehow reconcile it with his perfect will, It makes sense to them. And so I explained this to Father Spitzer, and he said, I agree with you. And I said, well, this is the way to tell people about Jesus. He said, I agree with you. Okay? Now, he agreed. I said, this is the only way that human suffering can be reconciled to the goodness of God. And this is why Christianity is unique. We're not just another wise religion. We have this, and no one else does. Other people talk about God's perfection and his justice, but they don't even know that there's a problem with suffering in that way, that a suffering and dying person can't be doing the will of a perfectly good and just God. So Islam, perfect deity, right? Forgives sin, right? Welcomes us even though we're diminished, right? How does he do that if he's perfectly just? And so how does he give his okay to something less than the highest? How does he forgive sin? How does he reconcile suffering with his justice? There's no answer. Christianity is the only way of answering it, and only in this way with what is here in the Bible. He said, I agree with you. And so I got my chance to talk to him, and Dr. Franks, I don't know if you overheard it or what, but after I was done with Father Spitzer, he said, oh, so what do you do? So I do theology, yeah, I'm doing it full time now. And in fact, I'm starting a website. Guess what it's called? NewApologetics.com. Yeah, I got the domain name like 2 weeks before Cardinal Levada came out and said that. It's providential. Okay, so he's intrigued. His eyeballs opened up when I said NewApologetics.com, because he's involved in new evangelization, and everyone knows what New Apologetics is. So I said, oh yeah, we're going to be putting forth stuff on theodicy and the redemption and new proofs for the existence of God. And I saw the opening here. I said, like, for example, here's what's new about it, and why we can get away with saying new apologetics. Have you ever considered that God is perfectly against evil? Well, no. Obviously, he's not perfectly against it, because he permits it. I was like, oh yeah, that's what people think. He permits it, and therefore he's not perfectly against it. But what I'm saying is, he's just, like we've conceived of him, omnipotent, omniscient, all that, but perfectly against every evil down to the last instance of suffering. No matter how small. Child drops his ice cream cone, it's an infinite offense to God, because that wasn't supposed to happen. Now, do you believe that that's God? And he said, well,
Right.
of course you don't, because it's a logical vacuum. How could it be? How could it be that he's that good? Right? But he is that good. And so everyone is dealing with something less than that, because it seems like it can't be that way. And I said, well, on New Apologetics, we're going to explain how it can be that way. And he's utterly intrigued. So I said, all right, well, here's another thing, because we have like 3 more minutes. So I quickly run through the basics of the redemption theory. Suffering and dying being can't be doing the will of God. Just for dessert before I go. And, he's really taking it in. And I was like, yeah, this goes really far, and this is just the start. But we're explaining everything all backwards, and people who are saying no to what we're saying are actually saying no to something that we shouldn't be saying, and they're right. And we need to learn from that and say what the church has actually given us. And so he said, yeah, I want to talk about it, totally. And as I was going, he said, you know what, I think you're wrong about that thing, permitting evil, because in the Catechism it says that God permits evil to draw a greater good out of it. And I said, no, it doesn't. It says that God doesn't permit an evil without being able to draw a greater good out of it. They're different. One is means to an end, and the other one is, for every evil that happens, God will draw a greater good out of it. Mm-hmm. And I said, when it's teaching this principle, it makes sure to formulate it in that secondary way. Now, Aquinas is quoted in the Catechism saying the first thing, but that's not the Catechism teaching that we have to understand permits as gives approval to. That's something that's put in there by hand externally. Permits just means doesn't prevent.
Right, doesn't block.
But everybody in the world understands permits in this context to mean doesn't oppose fully, doesn't perfectly oppose evil. For a purpose, there's a plan, and therefore he holds back in, okay, that's not what Aquinas meant. And the Catechism doesn't say that. Of course God permits evil when understood in that very, very basic sense of permits, because it happens, okay? But he perfectly disapproves of it, and it's like he's being tortured to death, right? It's like a mother watching her child have something tragic happen. How does God feel about that? The same way the mother feels, and then some. And if we don't have that right, we get everything else wrong, guaranteed, regardless of how clean our sentences are in correspondence with what's in the manual. We get the fundamentals wrong, everything goes. And we don't understand sin and why. Why is God against sin? Why is sin even a problem? The only reason sin is a problem is because it causes suffering. If sin didn't cause suffering, if we could be just as happy sinning as not sinning, then God wouldn't be against it. It would just be another thing that we do that didn't cause a problem. The reason why he's against it is because it hurts. And in fact, given who God is, perfect charity, love, if we could be happier by living without God, if he knew that we'd be happier not having to correspond with him, he would let us go and insist on it. Right? He wouldn't require that we be with him. Why? Because he's all about us. He wants us to be happy. That's who he is. But we can't be happy without him because he's obviously necessary. So he says, come back to me for your own good. So we don't even know why God's against sin. If you ask somebody the question, they'll stop dead in their tracks. We don't know. He's against sin because of suffering. And very interestingly, you pointed this out, Peter Kraft, in his book, Because God is Real, sort of tries to tackle this. He says, it's not just suffering that makes God against sin. Let's look at some other reasons why he's against sin. And then he begins to enumerate a list of reasons. And I don't know what happened when he was writing this, but every single thing that he lists, without exception, non-controversial, just plain as day, is a kind of suffering.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
And it's like, Peter, let's get together. But it's really just that, it's suffering. And we're trying to make it something else because if we say suffering is the problem, then that seems to undermine the other elements of the faith where suffering is redemptive. And it's infinitely meaningful. But it really doesn't. But we just think that it does, and we can't look at it cleanly. We can't look at it with fresh eyes because we're trying to defend against objections from every which way.
Well, I think that the Father Spitzer factor is really key. I was just with him in Napa, at the Napa Institute, and with a lot of leading theologians, and he's really at the forefront of this annual gathering, which is in its second year now. And it's very prophetic in nature. A lot of the most orthodox bishops and such are there, and the particular theme this year was Catholicism in the New America. But he had made a statement during one of his talks where he talked about, where we're talking about belief versus unbelief. He said, we're 2 generations away from an atheistic society. 2 generations. The first comes non-practice, and then comes non-belief. And so I think that considering that profound statement, this type of work is more than fashionable but relevant, and that will give you a really big stepping stone through someone like him who has a bigger voice than any of us.
Yes, there is a problem though. There is a problem in that a lot of his published work, right on the Magis Center website, is directly contradicting what I'm saying. He would have to retract it, and I don't know. I believe him to be a very humble man, a holy man.
He is.
That's hard. Okay, I know what that feels like being wrong on something that you've invested all kinds of effort into. But I think he could do it.